Hey, let's rock and roll. Welcome, everybody. Another week, another Parsha, a lot to get into, another jam-packed one, and we got to make up for last week, which was shorter. So we got to pack it all in. So Parshas Re'eh, we got a lot going on here. Same theme. Moshe is still speaking to the Jewish people. He's putting it out, laying it all out there, the options we have before us, the path to serve Hashem. And in the beginning of this week's Parsha, it starts with really an ultimatum of what our options are. Hashem doesn't force us to do anything. Hashem gives us free will. So the Parsha starts off, Re'eh anochi nosem lefnechem hayom bracha u'klola. See, I present before you today a blessing and a curse. Es habracha asher tishma'u al mitzvos Hashem, asher anochi mitzav eschem hayom. The bracha is going to be, if you listen to the ways of Hashem and you follow in the path of the mitzvos, the haklala im leis tishma'u al mitzvos Hashem. The sartem in haderech asher anochi mitzav hayom. And the curse will be if you don't follow in the ways of Hashem. So these are the options we have before us. And the Or HaChaim talks about how Moshe, who's the one who's saying this statement, needs to be somebody who's uniquely qualified to present this ultimatum before the Jewish people. Because if you would just have an Orthodox rabbi, a senior rabbi, you have a holy Jew who spent, 8-9 decades of his life learning Torah in his apartment in Bnei Brak, or, wherever he may live. And he's making the case to say that the life of the Torah is the life that is worth pursuing. So if you have somebody on the other side of the spectrum, you have somebody who was not raised in the path of the Torah, maybe wasn't privileged to have a Jewish education, and maybe is enjoying a wonderful life, is happy, is successful, has everything they need in life, might not feel that they're lacking anything. So the argument could be made, who are you to tell me what one side of the coin is about if you haven't seen the other side of the coin? Wonderful. You're telling me that a life of Torah is awesome. That's great. And I'm telling you that a life of enjoying a secular lifestyle and enjoying every piece of fun and pleasure on this planet is amazing. And until you've seen both sides, you can't present to me a proper argument to choose one. So the Or HaChaim says, this is why Moshe was uniquely qualified to do this. And the reason is because he experienced the highest of pleasures on both sides of the coin. The Or HaChaim says, let's read from his words a little bit. So he says, Moshe was able to present the contrast between the world on high, the world of spirituality, as well as someone who is familiar with all the goodness available in this world. He was extremely exalted with honor. He was a physically strong person, a king over the Jewish people, and extremely wealthy, as our sages has taught us. Thus, he had attained good fortune in every area of endeavor in this world. He was handsome, he was well-liked, he was famous, he was honorable, he was the most respected person. So he wasn't shunned and hated and, whatever. So he experienced a lot of honor and pleasure in this world. And of course, he ascended to heaven to receive the Torah, and he was able to savor the taste of the bliss that exists in the world to come. So now that he had a personal familiarity with both of these components, he had the ability to present this to the Jewish people. So says the Or HaChaim. And then the Or HaChaim talks about this idea that we are presented with good and bad. And he says that it sounds, let's see what his question is. Okay, so he says as follows. Moshe said to the people that you may see wicked people flourishing, successful, happy, but you should know that this happiness that they have is temporary and short-lived and will eventually make way for terrible curse. And that's what it means that Hashem says, Anochi, let's read the pasuk. I am giving you blessing and curse. And the Archaim points out that Re'eh is a singular terminology, even though Lifenechem is plural, meaning to say that every single individual has this option to choose from, as well as the emphasis on the word Hayom. I'm giving you today. What does it mean today? Was the day that Moshe was telling this to the Jewish people the day that the Jewish people received the Torah? No, it wasn't. It was 40 years later. So the idea is that we are constantly presented with this opportunity. We are constantly presented with the opportunity to choose good and bad. And the Archaim also points out that it doesn't say bracha ay klala. Ay would be or, blessing or curse. And you could choose blessing or curse. It says blessing and curse. And the Archaim explains that there is a component of curse in choosing the life of blessing and a component of blessing in choosing the life that is cursed. He says, he gives a parable, an analogy. He says somebody is at a crossroads. Maybe you're about to go out on a hike, or maybe you're out on a hike in the forest. You're at a crossroads, and you have two pathways branching out before you. One pathway is level and clear in the beginning, but then you walk a little bit, and then all of a sudden it gets choked with a web of thorns, and it's very hard or impossible to pass through. And one path is the opposite. It's choked with thorns in the beginning, but the end, it's level and clear. And while you're sitting there, a person, let's say, who was sitting in such a place would notify people who are passing by about the nature of the pathway ahead. You see that path? Right now, you have to choose between the clear and easy way and the thorny way. So it's going to be tempting for you to go the easy way. You should know that it'll be easy for a couple of steps, but in the end, you're going to get tangled in thorns. And vice versa. The other option, you might have to trudge through a little bit of thorns, but then it'll clear up. So he says that there's two kinds of goodness available to each and every one of us. We have bracha and klala, and each has a component of blessing and curse. And that is because when someone chooses a life of rishus, a life of steering away from the path of the Torah, it appears to be the easy way. It's the path of least resistance. It's certainly the most enjoyable way to go. It's certainly the most enjoyable life to live would be to ignore the Torah, to not want to listen to or learn about or educate ourselves about the lifestyle of the Torah, and just enjoy everything that the world has to offer, as does probably most of the world. So that has a component of blessing in it. That is the bracha in the life of klala, is the fact that it seems to be easy and enjoyable. And then you have the path of Chaim, the path of life, the path of the Torah. And that also has two aspects to it, but it's in the opposite order. Because when we start off on life, when we're in Olam Haza, we're in this world, the life of a Torah Jew is the more difficult one. The life of a Torah Jew involves much more self-control and self-sacrifice. And that's the one that seems to be harder, seems to have this element of klala in it. But once we get through these 2 or 3 steps, once we get through the difficulty in venturing off down that path, it's going to lead us to a life of pure bracha, a life of pure bliss, and ultimately an afterlife of pure bliss, of Olam Haba. So this is, essentially what Moshe is laying out is just a brutally honest way of looking at this. Nobody's suggesting that choosing the path of the Torah is going to be a walk in the park. But rather, it may be a bit difficult in the beginning, but eventually it gets easier and easier. And even if there's difficulty through our entire life in this world is temporary. This world is referred to by Chazal, by our sages, as one day, as passing in one day, because in the glimpse of the entire, the world and world history. It truly is a very short amount of time that we're here. And then we go on to the eternal world, to the world to come. And it's much more worthwhile for us to make our way through the thorns a little bit in this one to be able to reap the permanent eternal rewards that we'll get for the mitzvahs that we do in the world to come. So this is it. The Torah is acknowledging, and I love that the Torah does this, that we have free will. The Torah is not saying you absolutely will follow the way of Hashem. The Torah is saying, I'm laying it out. I'm giving you the options. In this book of the Torah contains everything you need to know to live the most meaningful, fulfilling, satisfying life that you possibly can in this world, and ultimately to gain the most we possibly can in the next world. And now it's in our hands to make that decision. So let's move on a little bit in the Parsha, touch on a couple other points here. So the Torah then tells us that if you will go to lands and you will see avodah zarah, you will see the way of the Goyim that are serving other gods. So there's an obligation so let's say when the Jewish people conquer the land of Israel, to destroy the remnants of avodah zarah that they find in the land. And the Torah says the way that the Goyim serve their God is not the way that we should serve our God. And what does that mean? The commentators explain that non-Jews who are serving idols have their own ideas of when to serve them and where to serve them and how to serve them. But we don't have our own ideas of how to serve Hashem and when to serve Hashem and where to serve Hashem. Rather, everything is clearly taught to us in the Torah. And we are not allowed to create our Judaism in a way that we choose to want to serve Hashem, but rather we follow the way that Hashem tells us to. When Hashem tells us to, one could be very tempted to say, hey, I want to bring a sacrifice. I want to bring a carbon. The Torah talks about a carbon so many times. I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to go to the Western Wall or try to get up on the Har HaBayis, on the Temple Mount, and actually bring a sacrifice. But that's not.
Also electricity on the other side.
You're kidding.
But that is not the way that Hashem wants us to serve him right now, unfortunately. So instead, we're going to follow the other ways that Hashem tells us to. Okay, then I'm kind of going to jump to a couple of points because I want to at least bullet point past them and mention some of them. So there's this idea about eating meat. So it's really fascinating. Before, in the earliest of times, and in the Midbar, for example, the Jewish people did not have the ability to go slaughter an animal and eat it. Instead, the only way to eat meat was to bring a carbon, bring a sacrifice, and certain sacrifices are allowed to be eaten by their owner. I think most of them, if I remember correctly. So you want to bring one, go bring a carbon shlamim, and you have meat to eat. But then, as the Jewish people are being, in a way, they're being weaned off of this life in a cradle in Hashem's arms. We're going into the land of Israel, and we're going to have to live our own life, and we're not just going to be sustained by God himself. And therefore, the Torah is acknowledging a person's desire to eat meat. So the Torah says in chapter 12, verse 20, when Hashem your God will broaden your boundary as he spoke to you, and you say, I would eat meat, for you will have a desire to eat meat. To your heart's entire desire, may you eat meat. If the place where Hashem your God will choose to place his name will be far from you, you may slaughter from your cattle and your flock that Hashem has given you, as I have commanded you, and you may eat in your cities according to your heart's entire desire. So it wasn't necessarily simple that a Jew can just go kill an animal and eat it. But now the Torah is giving its express kind of permission for us to go ahead and do that. And I want to read for you something interesting I saw from Rav Hirsch. Let's open it up here. So he explains, this is really, really cool reference here. So up until now, slaughtering of a cattle or sheep was only done in the Chatzir, in the Ohel Moed, in the Beis HaMikdash, under the supervision of the Kohen. But in the land, once the Jewish people are entering the land, they will have a permission of Basar Taiva to just go ahead, decide they're in the mood of eating meat, and go ahead and eat meat. Now, they're going to have to fulfill the mitzvah of shechita, of ritual slaughter, in order to be able to eat meat. Now, where is this mitzvah written? Meaning to say, where are the instructions to tell a shochet, someone who's going to go ahead and slaughter an animal the kosher way, how to do that? So the pasuk says, kasher tzivi sicha, as I have commanded you. I have news for you. Nowhere in the Torah does it say detailed laws of how ritual slaughter needs to be done. There are dozens of rules that must be followed. You have the mitzvah of how I could read the Hebrew or the English here, the kana and the veshet and the talish and the shia and mechuber and drasa, chalada, hagrama, ikor. These are literally, those words I just said are each a category of Jewish law related to shechita. And these are not talked about in the Torah. So what does it mean, kasher tzivi sicha? So Rav Hirsch points out that this is a clear reference to Torah Shebaal Peh, to the oral law, because nowhere in this book does it actually have these instructions, which means kasher tzivi sicha is a reference to another time that Hashem commanded Moshe and told Moshe a set of rules, and that is the oral law, Torah Shebaal Peh, which was given to Moshe at Sinai, together with Torah Shebechtav. So the Torah is actually referencing this and must be referencing something that's not in print in the Bible, in the Torah, and that is what it's being referred to. Moshe was instructed with all of these laws. This was passed on, Moshe to Yoshua, Yoshua to Zakanim, and on and on and on throughout entire Jewish history, eventually printed in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, made its way down to Shulchan Aruch and Torah and Rambam and all the books that we use to actually teach us Jewish law and teach us halacha. So that's a pretty incredible reference, clear reference to Torah Shebaal Peh that we see here in this week's parsha. Okay, let's move on to another area that we have a few verses later. The Torah says, be careful when Hashem, it's chapter 12, verse 29, when Hashem your God will cut down the nations to which you have come to take possession from them before you, and you will take possession from them and settle in their land, meaning the land of Israel. Beware for yourself, lest you be attracted after they have been destroyed before you, unless you seek out their gods, saying, how did these nations worship their gods? And even I will do the same. So I just find it interesting that the Torah is predicting an attitude that's going to come up. We're going to look around and we're going to see our friends, our neighbors, maybe our family members, living a life of ease, a life free of restrictions. It may not be idol worship, as is the literal understanding of this pasuk, talking about people who are worshiping other idols, but it'll be other sins, other lifestyles that are contrary to the life of the Torah. And we'll look around and we'll say, they're doing it, I can do that also. It's so easy to be influenced by the masses, by the people around us. And the message here is to stand strong from what could be the majority of people. You could go into a foreign land, you can go into, which is essentially every land in the world is a foreign land to us in a way, because every land has just secular lifestyle and secularism and sometimes different ways of looking towards religion, but certainly most places in this world, you will not find the general masses serving Hashem properly and following in the lifestyle of the Torah. So the Torah is kind of predicting that this is going to happen. It's going to be tempting. We see other people are perfectly comfortable doing these things, and Hashem is demanding that we rise above that and follow in his ways. And then the Torah talks about the idea, actually we had Devarim, the Eschanan, in Parshas V'Eschanan a couple of weeks ago as well, the idea not to add or take away from any of the Torah. As kol hadavar asher anochi mitzaveh eschem, oisai sishmeru la'asais leisaisif alav v'lei sigra mimenu. Chapter 13, verse 1, the entire word that I command you, you shall observe to do, you shall not add to it, and you should not subtract from it or take away from it. And the idea is that as long as we're following the Torah to the letter of the law, we're serving Hashem the way Hashem wants us to serve him. The second we deviate in even the slightest way from the way that Hashem tells us to serve him, so then we're not serving Hashem anymore. Now we're just serving our own interest. We have this, spiritual feeling that we want to have 614 mitzvahs, or we have this spiritual feeling where we say, no, we're good. We're very comfortable with 612 mitzvahs. I'm doing my part. I'm doing my mitzvahs. I'm serving God. I feel good about it. And it's okay to just do the parts that I want to do and maybe cut out one or two or more. So the Torah is saying clearly a mitzvah d'oraisa, or a biblical prohibition, lo sosif level sigra mimenu. This is how Hashem wants us to serve him, and we're not able to add to that or subtract for it. If we want to serve Hashem the way he wants to be served, is the way to do it, essentially. And then the Torah continues on, moving on to about 13:7, continuing with this idea that you'll have others who are going to entice you other ways. Okay, there's not a new concept of peer pressure against Torah Judaism. Not a new concept at all. Chapter 13, verse 7, if your brother, the son of your mother, or your son or daughter, other relatives, or a friend who is like your own soul, will entice you secretly, saying, let us go worship the gods of others that you did not know, you or your forefathers. From the gods of the peoples that are around you, those near, those far, other customs, other lifestyles, other traditions contrary to the Torah, you shall not accede to him and not hearken to him. Your eyes shall not take pity on him. You shall not be compassionate nor conceal him. Now, depending on what the nature of this is, if he's trying to force you to actually do avodah zarah, then there's an obligation for him to actually have the death penalty. You shall surely kill him. And he could be chayav skila, which is one of the death penalties of the Torah. So there's a very strong obligation that we have to watch out for people who are going to entice us away from the path of the Torah. In this sense, we're talking about people who are trying to get someone to serve idols, is obviously the worst of the worst. But again, I think it's the same idea that there's always people around us comfortably living a life that is a contradiction to Torah Judaism. And the Torah demands of us that we not be pursued by them, we not feel pressure from them. Following the way of Hashem requires you to be the black sheep. It requires you to be the different, the guy or girl who is different from other people, who has different standards that they're living by, that they need a different way of speaking or interacting, and certainly of practicing religion and serving Hashem and keeping Shabbos and all the unique and sometimes odd things about Torah Judaism, which in the eyes of other people seem to be very, very different, or people could have negative perceptions on this as well. We have to be mindful of that. Okay, let's move on to another idea. This got to be the most beautiful pasuk in the Torah. It would be at Revi, chapter 14, verse 1. Banim atem lashem elokechem. You are children to Hashem, your God. Hashem tells us that we are nothing less than his children. And what is the message to us? Lo sisgodadu v'lo sasimu karcha bein einayim lames. You should not cut yourself, and you should not make a bald spot between your eyes for a dead person, meaning out of anguish and pain over somebody who had died, to harm yourself, to cut yourself, to make a bald spot. Maybe that was like a common thing that was done. We are children of Hashem, and essentially our relationship with Hashem comes above all else, above all other relationships. And really this ties back to what we're saying before as well. You could have family members even and close friends who are trying to convince us, maybe not proactively, maybe extremely passively, that there's an easier life, that there's an easier way. But we should remember the most important relationship of all is the relationship we have with our Father, because we are all children of Hashem. And on a more literal note regarding cutting ourselves out of anguish, the idea is that anguish over the death of someone can never take precedence to our relationship with Hashem or our value of our bodies, right? The concept of cutting ourselves is like, what am I worth if he died? Or what am I worth if this happened? And Hashem is saying that our worth is permanent and our body is holy, and our ultimate relationship is with Hashem. And Hashem doesn't want us to hurt ourselves in any way. Rav Hirsch has a very interesting way of looking at this, and that is losis godadu. Losis godadu means don't cut ourselves. He said, what does it mean, don't cut ourselves? It means, let me look this up. It's not only referring to cutting our physical body, but also our national body. And the lesson is, as the Gemara says, Leisasu agudas agudas. We should not have different sects of Judaism, different bundles of Judaism. We should have complete national unity in observance of the Torah and not allow different discussions about the Torah and arguments in the Torah to let us split up into subcategories. This type of Jew, that type of Jew, that type of Jew. So there's going to be many, many halachic debates that are going to come up. And Rav Hirsch gives us a little bit of Jewish history. He says for over 1,200 years, until the first centuries of the period of the Second Temple, okay, that's from when the Torah is given until the Second Temple, there was complete agreement in the practice of the laws. There was only one single difference was not agreed upon, and that was an argument that the rabbis had regarding carrying an animal on Shabbos. There's a prohibition on Shabbos to carry items through public domain. That's where an Erev comes in, and Erev solves that issue. So whether one can carry an animal through the public domain for the purpose of fulfilling one of the mitzvos called smicha, which is part of the process of bringing an animal. And even Hillel and Shammai, who you might know as like people who have a lot of differences of opinion in the Gemara, even them only differed in 3 matters, only one of which it requires a biblical discussion, meaning everything else they were arguing about didn't boil down to a difference in Jewish practice, okay? So basically for 1,200 years, we did it right. And it was only in later times of their disciples when the political turmoil upset clarity and composure. And the leisure of the pupils of Torah study were no longer there. And then there was the catastrophic fall of the state, meaning Eretz Yisrael and the destruction of the temple. And we were oppressed and persecuted. Finally, they were able to break the connection, the clear path of rabbi to student, the pathway of determining halacha and Torah law. And then the Jewish people were scattered into different communities, and they weren't given cell phones and instant communication, and everybody had to start developing their own community and court system and rabbis and Bezdin and all of these things. And there was doubts and there was questions and differences of opinions regarding tradition and interpretation of tradition. Then finally, different practices started to become commonplace. Okay, don't give up. The Jewish people didn't give up. We want to have one. We want to have one national body. We want to all be serving Hashem the way that the Torah requires of us. We don't want to fight about it. We don't want to have different customs and different ideas. So then Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi collected all this material, and he sifted through it, and he organized all of these differences of opinion. And he created the Mishnah. He wrote the Mishnah. And then you already had some level of consistency there. These are the traditions, these are the disputes, and this is what we actually do, or this is what these people do, and meaning to say it was becoming a huge mess. It was out of control. We couldn't keep even track of who said what and what we should actually do. And then 250 years later, Ravina and Rav Ashi came and they edited the Gemara to help maintain record of opinions and customs in an even more organized manner. So they continue to do so, even though the Jewish people are getting more and more dispersed, and over time there's more and more opinions being written, everything is organized. And then I'm going to add on to Rav Hirsch, maybe later in the essay he says this himself, but eventually, as the years went by, so meaning to say, in the days of the Talmud, the rabbis knew how to create halacha. They didn't need the code of Jewish law, right? The Shulchan Aruch or the Rambam, Maimonides, because they knew how to establish the law out of the discussions of the Talmud. Time passed on, and we got even more dispersed and more opinions and more ideas, and eventually we needed to put this all in check. So therefore, systems were created on how to determine Jewish law, and that followed to the writing of the Shulchan Aruch and the Torah and the Rambam, Maimonides, and ultimately, the most recent universally accepted code of Jewish law essentially was the Mishnah Berurah, who lived in the early 1900s, who wrote, on an even more up-to-date basis with more, modern examples and cases and taking other things into account. So we have a system, and you might look at the amount of books in the Beis Medrash, the amount of Jewish books there are, the amount of differences of opinions they are, and say, this is such a mess. The truth is, it's not a mess. It just takes work to understand how to make sense of 100,000 books. And that is the work of Torah scholars. That is the work that we can all do. It's not hidden from us. The path to halacha is no secret. It's no secret. It's clearly, it's published material. You can easily train to know how do we decide what to do? What is our tradition? So yes, after all this time, you'll have groups like Sephardim and Ashkenazim that will have different tradition, but even within them, there's going to be a clear path of how to determine final halacha. And that is what the Torah is demanding of us. Don't let the oral law become a mess that is up to everybody to try to figure out how to interpret. Keep a system so that we could all follow Hashem in the ways of the Torah. And there's no vagueness to this. There's no vagueness to this. You go into a kollel, you go into a Beis Medrash, there's a path to how we determine halacha. And that's what the Torah is saying. Don't create alternative groups. Don't create new ways of interpreting things that are not following the tradition that has clearly been passed from rabbi to student, from rabbi to student. And that's what Rav Hirsch says. So, when I first saw this, I thought this was like so funny. Like, really? You think there's like one way of doing things? Look at how many differences of opinions there are in Judaism. But the answer is to have this system, which thank goodness we do, and to follow this system. Now, there's a lot more. We only have a few minutes left. This is really a jam-packed parsha. I want to touch on one more idea on the topic of giving charity, of giving tzedakah. Oh, I don't. Okay, let's see. So we have chapter 15, verse 7. Beautiful. This is so beautiful. So beautiful, the way of the Jewish people, the way of the Torah. If there shall be a destitute person among you, chapter 15, verse 7, any of your brethren in any of your cities, any Jew, anywhere in the world, in your land that Hashem gives you, you shall not harden your heart or close your hand against your destitute brother. Rather, you shall open your hand to him. You shall lend him his requirement, whatever is lacking to him. Beware lest there be a lawless thought in your heart, saying, okay, what is your thought? The Torah is warning you. Okay, the Torah is telling us to take care of each other, to give charity, to take care of our poor brothers and sisters. And the Torah is predicting some rationale you're going to have in your mind. And what is that? The 7th year approaches, the remission year. And you will look upon your destitute brother and refuse to give him. Skip the word there. Meaning to say, in the times of Shemitah was the toughest year. Every 7th year, you let your field grow. Okay, we don't live in a world of Shemitah, and we don't live in a world of farmers, for the most part. So we might not relate to this, but imagine you were a farmer in the days that Shemitah was observed. You were in the land of Israel, and you had a biblical obligation to let your fields grow in the 7th year. And now it's the 6th year, okay? And it is, the month of Av, the month of Elul. We're right before Rosh Hashanah. And now you get charity appeals. That's not a time that you want to give charity. You're in big trouble next year. You got to figure out your finances for the 7th year. Do not, beware not to let this thought cross your mind. And then he, the poor person, might appeal against you to Hashem, and it will be sin upon you. You shall surely give him, and let your heart not feel bad when you give him. For in return for this matter, Hashem your God will bless you in all your deeds and in your every undertaking. For destitute people will not cease to exist in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall surely open your hand to your brother, to your poor, and to your destitute in your land. So we have a modern day Shemitah. Our modern day Shemitah is called inflation. Life is getting very expensive. The Torah is telling us this day will come when you're being pinched, when you yourself are having a tight year, you're having a tough time financially, and it's tempting to say, look, this is just not a good time. I've got to make budget cuts. I've got inflation. I've got to make budget cuts. I can't give as much as I used to. The Torah says, don't have that attitude. Don't close your hands from the poor man amongst you. Give to him, and Hashem will bless you in your undertaking. Hashem will pay you back. This will be billed to God's account, and Hashem will surely not let you lose financially for being kind and generous and compassionate to your brother. But I think another thing that is very fascinating here is the Torah says, do not feel bad when you give him. Isn't that interesting? That's a tough emotion. The Torah is saying, okay, not only do I want you to give charity, I want you to feel awesome about it. I don't want you to feel, oh, I just gave, and that was so tough. And you're at the end of the month and you're doing your budget and you say, okay, I gave this amount of money to Verizon and this amount of money to Comcast and this amount of money to my car insurance and my mortgage. And, oh man, I gave another few $100s to this organization or to this charity organization or to this poor person who asked me, and like, oh, it's just tough. The Torah is saying, feel generous about it. Feel good about it. Don't feel guilty about it. Certainly, once we're doing a mitzvah, we should certainly try to feel as good about it as we can, and definitely not, God forbid, regret a mitzvah that we're doing. So I had some, let's see, we had some things from Rav Hirsch here. I'm just not sure if I have enough time for it. Let me see how long it is. Hang on. 15:07. So, I mean, Rav Hirsch talks about essentially the system of the way the Jewish people take care of poor people. And there's basically two ways. There's the individual and there's the community. So Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, are tasked with a responsibility that they need to make sure that there's no poor people. We need to collectively establish the organizations that we need to take care of people within our city. And then we as an individual also have a requirement to give what we can to help solve this problem. So basically, you'll have more wealthy people that are going to give more. Or Rav Hirsch warns us not to think that the job to support the poor is for the community, meaning I'm not a rich guy, I'm not a wealthy guy, I'm not going to support the local Biker Cholim or Tomchei Shabbos or whatever organization it is, because I don't got the funds for that. I don't have the money for that. So Rav Hirsch explains that the Torah is telling us, yes, correct. You're not going to be the one that's going to make the difference balancing the budget books of charity organizations. But that doesn't absolve us of our obligation to do our part. And that's part of what it says. Ki lo yachdel evyon mikarav haaretz. It will never cease to exist, poor people in our land. What does that mean? It means our job is not to solve world hunger. We are not going to. It's not going to happen. There's nothing we're going to do that's going to create that there isn't a single poor person in the world. or I guess in the context of these verses, a single poor Jew in the world. So our job is not to play God. God chooses and has a million calculations as to why some people have a more difficult time and some people an easier time, but rather our obligation is to fill our role in doing our part. So we could look at our budget and we could say, okay, I've got $5 to give to charity. And Rav Hirsch explains, don't laugh that off. Don't say, I've only got a few dollars. I'm not helping these people anyway. We should jump at the opportunity to do the mitzvah and pretend that you're wealthy. And this is, I'm going a little off script here from Rav Hirsch. If you had 10 grand to give to charity or 100 grand to give to charity, how would you do it, right? Would you give it all to one place? Would you say, okay, I want to split it up. I want to support my local synagogue and, poor people, and maybe I want to help with sick people, and maybe the kollel, and maybe whatever. You might have a plan to distribute it. Do that with your $5. Do that with your $5. Give $1 to one organization and 50 cents for another. I know it's like laughable thought, and we don't think we're making much of a difference. But lo yachtel evyon mikarev haaretz. The need will always be there. Our obligation is not to solve the needs of all poorness in the world. Our job is to do our part, to take the blessing that Hashem gave us, no matter how big or small it is, and do those mitzvahs. So if you have $5 to give to charity, that should be meaningful and important and powerful in your eyes. We could be tempted to not even give the $5, because what's the difference? What kind of difference is it going to make? Value that and acknowledge that we're fulfilling unbelievable mitzvahs of Hashem and the will of Hashem, and distribute that the same way you would distribute $1 million. Decide where your values are, decide who you want to give to, distribute it, split it up. And if you're embarrassed to give an organization 50 cents, you can go on their website and you could probably donate anonymously and find some way to do it. So that's another message from the end of this. Okay, so that's all for today. We're out of time. Jam-packed Parsha. Take a look at it yourself if you have a few minutes. And until then, we will see you next week. If anybody has any questions, comments, feel free to weigh in.
All set. Thank you very, very much.
Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Bye.